Let me start with a simple but uncomfortable question. How did Iran become the country that both the United States and Israel see as one of their most serious enemies in the Middle East? This wasn't sudden, it wasn't emotional, and it certainly wasn't accidental. This story has been building for more than 4 decades, layer by layer, war by war, decision by decision. And today, we are at a point where many analysts quietly ask a dangerous question behind closed doors. If the US and Israel decide to strike Iran together, could they actually defeat Iran easily? To understand that, we have to go back in time, because this story did not start with missiles, nuclear talks, or proxy militias. It started with a revolution. The turning point, 1979. Before 1979, Iran was not America's enemy. In fact, Iran was one of America's closest allies in the Middle East. The Shah of Iran was backed by Washington. Iran bought American weapons. US intelligence worked closely with Tehran. And Israel? Israel and Iran had quiet but very real cooperation. Then came the Islamic Revolution. Ayatollah Khomeini came to power, and overnight, Iran's foreign policy flipped upside down. America was no longer a partner, it became the Great Satan. Israel was no longer a distant state, it became the illegitimate Zionist regime. This wasn't just political language, it became a core part of Iran's identity. From that point forward, Iran's leadership believed something very specific. If Israel and American influence dominate the Middle East, Iran will never be secure. So Iran didn't just oppose Israel and the US, it built an entire regional strategy around countering them. Israel's view, why Iran became the ultimate threat. From Israel's perspective, the danger from Iran is not like the danger from Hamas or Hezbollah. Hamas is close, Hezbollah is armed, but Iran is different. Iran is the brain behind both. Israel sees Iran as the architect of a long-term plan to surround Israel from every direction. Look at the map. Hezbollah in Lebanon to the north, militias in Syria to the northeast, Hamas, and Islamic Jihad in Gaza to the south, Iranian influence growing in Iraq, Houthis in Yemen, threatening Red Sea shipping routes. Israel doesn't see these as separate problems. Israel sees them as pieces of one puzzle, designed in Tehran. And here is the part that truly worries Israeli planners. Iran does not need to attack Israel directly. It can fight Israel without ever crossing its own borders. That is what makes Iran uniquely dangerous in Israel's eyes: the nuclear fear. Now we come to the issue that changed everything: Iran's nuclear program. Israel can tolerate rockets, it can tolerate militias, it can tolerate proxy wars, but a nuclear-armed Iran, that is where Israel draws a red line. Because Israel's security doctrine has always been based on one principle: no hostile power in the region can be allowed to gain nuclear capability. That's why Israel struck Iraq's reactor in 1981. That's why Israel struck Syria's reactor in 2007. And that's why Israel watches Iran more closely than any other country on earth. Even when Iran says its nuclear program is peaceful, Israel does not believe it, because from Israel's point of view, intent can change overnight. Capability is what matters. And once Iran has the capability, it cannot be undone. America's angle, it's bigger than Israel. For the United States, Iran is not only an Israeli problem. Iran challenges American influence across the entire Middle East. Iran opposes US military presence in the Gulf. Iran threatens oil shipping lanes in the Strait of Hormuz. Iran supports armed groups that have attacked American forces in Iraq and Syria. But more importantly, Iran represents a model that Washington cannot control. Unlike many Middle Eastern states that depend on US protection, Iran built a system that resists American pressure, sanctions, and isolation. And over time, something surprising happened. Iran didn't collapse under sanctions, it adapted. It built regional networks. It deepened ties with Russia and China. It became more self-reliant militarily. So from Washington's perspective, Iran is not just a regional nuisance. It's a long-term strategic challenger, the silent war that already exists. Here's something many people don't realize. Iran, Israel, and the United States are already in a war. It's just not a declared one. Cyber attacks, airstrikes in Syria, assassinations of scientists, attacks on oil tankers, drone warfare through proxies. This shadow conflict has been going on for years, and each side is careful not to cross the line into full-scale war. But the line is getting thinner. Every year, every incident, every escalation, why Israel feels time is running out. Israeli officials rarely say this publicly, but privately many believe something critical. The longer Iran is left alone, the stronger it becomes. Stronger missiles, stronger proxy forces, stronger regional influence, more advanced nuclear knowledge. And from Israel's perspective, waiting only makes a future conflict harder and more dangerous. That's why Israel has repeatedly signaled that it is willing to act alone if necessary. Because for Israel, this is not about politics, it's about survival. If war starts today, would it be easy? This is where the real debate begins. Many people assume that if the US and Israel attack Iran, it would be quick and decisive. After all, the US has the world's most powerful military. Israel has one of the most advanced air forces and intelligence systems. But Iran is not Iraq. Iran is not Libya. Iran is not Syria. Iran is geographically huge, mountainous, difficult to invade, militarily prepared for asymmetric war. Iran has spent decades preparing for exactly this scenario, not to win a conventional war, but to make any war unbearably costly, and that changes the equation completely. Iran's real strategy, not winning, but punishing. Iran knows it cannot defeat the US in open battle, so it built a strategy around something else. If attacked, Iran will not try to defend only its territory. It will set the entire region on fire. Hezbollah rockets from Lebanon, militias targeting US bases in Iraq and Syria, Houthis disrupting Red Sea trade, Strait of Hormuz shipping chaos. Oil prices would surge, global markets would panic, regional governments would be dragged in, and suddenly this is no longer a simple Israel-Iran or US-Iran war. It becomes a Middle East-wide crisis. That is Iran's deterrence, the psychological factor. There is another layer here that is often ignored: national pride. Iran sees itself as a civilization thousands of years old. It does not respond to threats the way smaller states do. Pressure often hardens its position rather than softening it. And Israel knows this, and Washington knows this, which is why, despite years of tension, full war has not yet happened. Because everyone understands, once it starts, controlling it will be nearly impossible. At this point, the situation is like dry grass in summer. All it takes is one spark, one miscalculation, one strike too far, one retaliation too strong, and the Middle East could enter a conflict unlike anything we've seen in decades. And that brings us to the most important question. If that war really begins, what happens next? The first 72 hours, shock and fire. If Israel and the United States launch coordinated strikes, the first targets would be very clear: nuclear facilities, missile bases, Revolutionary Guard command centers, air defense systems. The goal would be simple: blind Iran quickly and limit its ability to respond. But Iran would not wait. Within hours, Hezbollah in Lebanon would likely begin launching rockets toward northern Israel. Militias in Iraq and Syria would start targeting American bases. The Houthis in Yemen could begin attacking ships in the Red Sea, and Iran itself would fire ballistic missiles toward Israeli and possibly US military positions in the region. This would not be a slow escalation. This would be simultaneous chaos. Air defenses over Israel would be overwhelmed, not because they are weak, but because the volume would be unprecedented. The United States would suddenly have to defend not just Israel, but its forces across multiple countries. And oil markets, they would react instantly. The Strait of Hormuz, the economic trigger. Nearly 20% of the world's oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran doesn't need to permanently block it. Even the threat of disruption is enough. Insurance costs for ships would skyrocket. Oil prices could jump overnight. Stock markets would drop in panic. Countries far from the Middle East, Europe, Asia, even parts of Africa, would feel the economic shock within days. Fuel prices rise. Transportation costs rise. Food prices rise. This is how a regional war becomes a global economic event. And that is exactly the kind of leverage Iran has prepared for. The war Israel fears, most the northern front. For Israel, the most dangerous part of this war would not be Iran directly. It would be Hezbollah. Hezbollah has tens of thousands of rockets and precision missiles. Unlike Gaza, this would be a sustained heavy barrage on major Israeli cities and infrastructure, power plants, airports, military bases. Israel would be forced into a large-scale ground and air campaign in Lebanon, while also dealing with threats from Gaza and possibly Syria. This is the multi-front war Israeli planners have feared for years. And in this scenario, it becomes reality. America's dilemma. For the United States, the problem would not be striking Iran. It would be managing the consequences. U.S. bases in Iraq, Syria, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, all within range of Iranian or proxy attacks. American troops suddenly under constant threat. Washington would face a difficult choice: escalate further and hit Iran harder, or try to contain the situation before it spreads beyond control. And this is where politics meets military reality, because once American soldiers start taking casualties, public pressure inside the U.S. changes quickly. Iran's internal situation. During war, many assume war would weaken Iran internally, but history shows something different. External attacks often unite Iranian society behind its leadership. Nationalism becomes stronger than political differences. Even critics of the government tend to support resistance when the country is under attack. So instead of collapsing, Iran could become more determined. And the longer the war drags on, the more unpredictable the situation becomes. What happens to the economies? Now let's talk about the part rarely discussed in military analysis. What happens after the bombs fall? Iran's economy. Iran is already under heavy sanctions. War would damage infrastructure, oil facilities, transport networks. But Iran's economy has adapted to surviving under pressure. It would suffer deeply, but it would not disappear. Instead, Iran would likely move even closer to China and Russia for survival. A wartime economy, a resistance economy. Hardship, yes. Collapse, unlikely. Israel's economy. Israel's economy is modern, globalized, tech-driven, and extremely sensitive to instability. Prolonged missile attacks, mobilization of reserves, damage to infrastructure, this would hit Israel's economy hard. Foreign investment slows, air travel stops, business operations disrupted. Israel can fight wars. It has before. But a long, multi-front war with Iran-backed forces would be economically painful in ways not seen before. The power game behind the scenes. While missiles fly, other powers would be watching very carefully. Russia would benefit from rising oil prices and U.S. distraction. China would call for calm publicly, but quietly secure energy deals with Iran. Gulf countries would be terrified of being dragged into the conflict. No one wants this war, but many would try to take advantage of it. This is how global geopolitics silently moves during regional wars. 3 possible future scenarios. Now, the most important part: where could this lead? Scenario 1. Short, violent, contained, heavy strikes, heavy retaliation. But within weeks, international pressure forces a ceasefire. Damage is severe, but the war does not expand further. Tension remains high for years. Scenario 2. Regional wildfire. Hezbollah, Iraq militias, Yemen, Syria, all fully involved. Israel fighting on multiple fronts. U.S. deeply engaged. Oil crisis spreads globally. Months of conflict, severe regional destabilization. Scenario 3, the most dangerous outcome. Iran accelerates its nuclear program after the war, believing it now must obtain a nuclear deterrent. Israel becomes even more aggressive in prevention. The region enters a permanent cycle of brinkmanship. Not peace, not war, but a constant edge of both. The human cost that often gets ignored. Behind all the strategy, there are ordinary people. Families in northern Israel living under sirens. Civilians in Lebanon caught between Hezbollah and Israeli airstrikes. Iranian families facing shortages, blackouts, and fear. American soldiers far from home under constant threat. Wars are discussed in maps and missiles, but lived in kitchens, hospitals, and shelters. And this war would be felt by millions who never chose it. The big question. So here we are, a situation where Israel believes waiting makes Iran more dangerous. Iran believes resistance is the only way to survive. The United States wants to prevent escalation, but also contain Iran. Everyone is preparing. No one wants to be the first to start, but everyone is ready if it starts. And that is what makes this moment in history so tense. Because sometimes wars don't begin because someone wants them. They begin because everyone believes they cannot afford to back down. And the real question is not who would win. The real question is, after such a war, would the Middle East ever be the same again?